So these are relatively narrow, quite big houses. Essentially 3.5 stories, living spaces on this side. They've got little courtyards in the middle, and they've got a garage at the end with more accommodation sitting on top of it, with another courtyard garden sort of in between. And then they've got a master bedroom up on the top. In that pattern of courtyard houses, along this stretch, there are 4 blocks. There are 3 very similar blocks, and then this space sits in the middle. And this space here, which is the widest of the communal gardens, was defined by that tree. So a lot of the spaces we were creating by building as close as we could to the existing trees, whilst retaining them, because they are amazing. I mean, this is an amazing plane tree, and so that actually defines this space, which was quite an interesting way of designing a project. You know, thinking about individual trees. A little bit risky; it could have died, but we tried to make sure that the ones that we used were quite healthy. So this is what I was saying about this sort of relationship between inside and outside. In a way, it all comes down to people feeling comfortable with each other. So if you're in your house, some of these people are clearly quite happy to have their blinds up, and they don't mind people walking past it, perhaps not always this many people. Some people have blinds, but in a way, I think that's part of the deal, that you find a way of living in a space where your property comes to this point here, to a metre, 3/4 of a metre away from your facade. That's it. The rest of your property is within the house, and then all of this is communal, and these paths through are public, but generally speaking, I think people feel that they are kind of owned spaces, so they're not like a major through route, but you can walk through, there's no restriction. And in the centre you've got spaces where you can gather, so you can meet for coffee on a Sunday or something with your neighbours, and they're the sort of things that you often say when you're designing a project, but actually here it actually happened. So right from the beginning, people were coming out and using their space and meeting their neighbours and forming a community. So this all of the spaces tend to connect through one end to the other. So you've got the perimeter landscape on that side, and then on this side you've got that central belt of trees with the main street coming down through. And as I said, all of the spaces are very simple, very linear spaces. We're not creating complex forms of building. They're just creating very simple, generally rectangular spaces. What you also see looking down this street is the kind of pattern of the development on this side. So we've got, the half of the development essentially is over here. Actually, not quite half. Maybe a third is over here, 2/3 over here. You can see that there's a rhythm of these blocks of 4 houses. The short, large 4-storey terraces are mews, and then you've got 2 ends of these courtyard houses with a garden space in between, and that repeats. So up here you've got 2 mews, down here you've got 2 mews, and then you've got these blocks of buildings sitting in between. So there's quite an interesting sort of rhythm as you go down the street. And some of the houses, these ones, have a direct face onto the main street. The others are ends where the courtyard houses turn at the end. So if we walk up this way, we'll show you that relationship. One of the other things that was very important early on was to establish a kind of palette of materials. And we said, well, basically we're going to use brick, we're going to use copper, we're going to have dark window frames, and some timber. So that established a language, and then we kind of allowed people for the designs to evolve. And they have similar themes around the public and private space, particularly the little courtyards and roof terraces and the like, but they are quite distinct types. Richard's houses are quite narrow, tall townhouses. On this side they tend to be slightly broader. So they're all very different, but within that same kind of palette of materials. You can see here this sort of valley effect. Now, in many ways, the buildings ought to be facing the same way. So these ones are facing south this way. These ones are sort of facing the wrong way almost. But because the buildings have cuts through, so you'll see at the top level you've got these sort of cuts through, the little roof terraces that cut all the way through them. That means that sunlight can get in still. What it does though is it creates this again, this sort of communal space between this valley of space with the terraces dropping down, with all of the private landscape, the potted plants and things that everybody goes to town with, all help to build into this central landscape space. It's, I think, one of the things that is unique about the scheme still, probably, that the quality of these bits of landscape and the main structural landscape is quite exceptional. And I think I mentioned earlier on that there is some research into the value of trees, and I know that the trees helped Countryside to sell the properties, because on day one you had this wonderful backdrop for all your buildings. But actually, I think there is actually a financial benefit as well. I don't know whether this is borne out, but there's been some research done relatively recently, a few years ago, into the value of trees in housing developments. Now, you don't often get sites like this with this sort of quality of tree. There were 790 trees on site when we came. We cut down almost 100 of them and planted another 150. So there's masses of existing landscape, which is wonderful. But these spaces were largely, obviously not here, or in fact completely not here. So this tree is not an original tree. So this was all created. So Countryside invested in this as part of the scheme, and most housing developers still don't really do that. And I think it's a real missed opportunity, because it's what helps to create that sort of sense of community. These spaces and the kind of character that's in the spaces. These 90-year-old pear trees, they're almost like part of the community. It's sort of stretched out, touching fingers.
So this is an apartment building designed by Alison Brooks. There's 2 apartments per level. They're essentially the same plan, but the articulation of the facade in and out just gives a slightly different shape to each of the rooms, and directs the views either in one direction or the other. Generally, as the original architects were only really involved in detail in the first phase, other than Alison Brooks, who was involved in the detail of this building, because I think maybe they thought she's the only one who really understands how it should be put together. So some of these haven't been realised in quite the level of detail that the first phase has. But I think these ones are quite interesting because they're quite uniquely different from the first phase. These are really large, grand houses, and I think this space is quite amazing with the playground there and the two apartment buildings. And then I think the tallest building on the site in the end was the apartment building that sits behind there, which is got the large timber frame on it, which was to an original design by Field & Clegg Bradley. But we were designing these houses to try and, in a way with the 2 different types, to try and include some of that richness that you get with houses that have evolved over 50, 100 years and have had bits added to them. Yeah. And actually I think that's quite nice, and we made 2 essentially different types. But what I enjoy about sort of London now is you have a terrace of houses, and actually no one is exactly the same, because they've all evolved in slightly different ways, and they've got slightly different because no one lives a Victorian lifestyle in these houses. People have adapted them all in different ways to meet the requirements of modern life, and they've been very robust. And so I always imagine that these could have, and they can have that life. As a lot of Victorian houses are in conservation areas, and you have those constraints, and you can still evolve them here.
Time tells.
Yeah. But I think that's it's a real compliment that people seem to enjoy the houses so much. Anyway, shall we?
It feels still very modern and contemporary, and yet there is that richness of, you get that sort of sense of having lots of different types of buildings together that gives that richness, which is really lovely.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was, it wasn't originally Countryside's concept, but what Field & Clegg Bradley suggested about having 3 architects, I think it worked very well for the site as a whole, because I think, whilst we've used a very similar material palette to Field & Clegg Bradley, we had slightly different plots, and we've actually got a different set of ideas about how the houses are organised internally. In a way, they've got a number of houses that are slightly different versions on the one set of ideas. Ours have got a set of versions on the other. And Alison's different again. I think but Alison's buildings are also quite different in their external appearance, but I think that's also, you know, because there's a sort of consistency, a background, and then to have these sort of special moments where there's something different is very important. And that's what you to some extent get in the richness of an existing city. I particularly enjoy along this stretch the number of people that have bikes on their front terrace, or have the door to the kitchen open, or you know, that informality, I think, is exactly what we were trying to achieve with the idea of a veranda entrance. And the fact that this path is a little more private than a road would be, so it tends to probably just if you're coming to visit someone here, or you know where you're going.
There's a big boundary between you and the road, isn't there?
Yeah, imagine if you live here, you know, you build your kids build their den in this bit here somewhere.